We are glad to have here Professor N.T. Wright. He is the former Bishop of Durham, which, if I'm correctly, that makes you the House of Lords currently, and but most well known for being a biblical scholar and the author of numerous texts. I believe it's 50 different books you have titled on New Testament scholarship and religious studies. So I won't exhaust this. He is, for many, does not need an introduction, so we're excited to have you here. So welcome, Professor Wright.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a surprise and a delight to be here. Google for me is something that comes up on the screen, and actually thinking of it as a place, never mind a campus, never mind people, is kind of blowing my mind right now, and I'm very happy about that. I'm also happy about the fact that whereas in my previous job when I was Bishop of Durham, almost every church meeting I went to, I significantly reduced the average age of those present. I think now I'm significantly increasing the average age of those. I suspect I'm at least twice as old as most of you here in this room, and I'm very happy about that. It reminds me that I'm on my way to retirement and to listening to music and playing on the golf course and so on. But at the moment I'm still bouncing around talking about God and Jesus and the Bible and church and the world and culture and what we should be doing in our culture. And since you people are part of the people who are shaping the way that people, not only what people think about, but the way people think, what I want to try to do today is to put out some parameters to do with how I think the gospel, the Christian good news, actually works, and then to reflect just a little on what being human within that good news might look like, and what as humans we ought to be doing in order to engage with the wider world in a way which is wise and honest and actually deeply Christian. The idea of Christians engaging with the world at all has often been at a discount. People think, well, I don't really belong in this world, I have a spiritual identity, I'm off someplace else, and actually that is deeply unbiblical, deeply untrue to the Jewish and Christian vision. I'll explain in a moment. But let me say one or two things about good news. I have a book coming out, which has just come out, called simply Good News. I'm not sure it's actually as simple as some people think, but I'm trying to make it simple. But the main message of that book is that, contrary to popular imagination, the Christian message is good news, not good advice. And there is all sorts of difference between news and advice. And news is a funny sort of thing. I mean, many people think you go to church in order to get good advice about how to live. Well, maybe you do, but that's not the main point. Or good advice about how to reorder your private spirituality. Well, that, again, may happen, but that's not the whole point of it. Or even good advice about which technique to be sure you plug into so that after your death you go to the right destination. Well, again, that seems pretty important, but that sounds like advice rather than news. News is about something that happens as a result of which the world is a different place, often in ways that people don't expect, sometimes in ways that they don't want. You all know where you were on September the 11th, 2001. I bet you don't know where you were on November the 22nd, 2003. I know exactly where I was. I was in a hotel room in Atlanta, Georgia, and I phoned home at 5 in the morning because the television screens were not showing the event that I wanted to see, which was the final of the Rugby World Cup, because England were playing Australia in Australia, and nothing Australians like more than to beat the British at one of their sports. So I was naturally, England had made it to the final, astonishingly. So I was on pins to find out, and I knew my daughter would be glued to the television. So I phoned her at the appointed hour. Oh, Dad, it's terrible. It's got to full time and the score is 17-all and they have to play another half hour and it's all very tense. And so I got up and I paced around and I waited for half an hour and I phoned her again and, hey, yay, we won. And the last kick of the match, Johnny Wilkinson, who was the poster boy of English rugby, had done a drop goal. And as a result, England had won and Australia were decimated. And then I had a dilemma. I was in a semi-dark hall in a hotel in Atlanta, Georgia, and I wanted to go up and hug the hall porter and say, did you hear we won the World Cup? And I wrote, he probably doesn't know what rugby is. He may not even know where Australia is, let alone anything else. And I sort of wanted to tell the checking clerks, did you hear the news? This means nothing to them whatever. And I was waiting for somebody to come downstairs to the conference who knew that there had been a game going on. And finally somebody did, and it was an Australian. So I had this good news, which was foolishness to the Americans, scandalous to the Australians, but for those of us who believed, it made us happy. It made us happy all year. And one of the effects was hundreds, thousands of little English boys and at least hundreds of little English girls wanted to be Johnny Wilkinson when they grew up and would be practicing drop goals in the schoolyard. Something had happened as a result of which everything looked different. Now, of course, in sport, that doesn't last. We haven't been one of my Australian friends who read this book and saw that I used that story up front sent me a rude email saying, "You wait, you won't be using too many more of those stories. We'll get you." I did actually when it happened, I sent him an email congratulating the Australians on being such good losers. And he sent one straight back here saying, "Yeah, considering how little practice we have at it, at losing, that is." But you see, news is about something that's happened as a result of which the world is a different place, and as a result of which things kind of fracture. Some people say, this doesn't make any sense in our world. Other people say, this makes all the wrong kind of sense in my world. But some people find that it transforms their lives. And in the early Christian world, that's what happened. How did it transform their lives? What was going on? Well, the gospel, the good news, is a message about Jesus. But so many people have put that message within an implicit backstory, which makes it different from how the early Christians saw it. You see, my backstory was that I've been following English rugby since the days when, believe it or not, I played rugby myself as a teenager. I've been interested in what they're doing, following them. I knew the backstory. The Australians knew their backstory, and those two were going to clash. The Americans in Atlanta had no backstory at all, no interest, didn't mean a thing. I might as well go out on the street in St Andrews and say that, I don't know, Duke have beaten Caltech at basketball or something. You know, people just aren't terribly interested in St Andrews. I'm sorry about that. What's the backstory? The backstory for so many people, both inside the church and outside, goes like this: that there is this dangerous God somewhere up in the sky. Maybe we're not sure, but if there is, he's dangerous. He's made a very high moral bar which he wants us all to jump over. We've all failed to jump over that moral bar, so he's out to get us. But then at the last minute, fortunately, somebody else steps in the way, takes the hit in our place. Phew, so it's all right. And it happens to be his own son. So somehow that's okay. Now, I have not yet found a preacher who admits to having preached the gospel like that, but I know many, many people in many, many churches for whom that is what they've actually heard. That's what they think more or less the message is about. The backstory actually is very different to that. The backstory is about a good God who made a good world, and who made human beings to be within his good world as people who would bring wisdom and order and flourishing and possibility to that world, to develop his creation. It says, be fruitful and multiply and look after the world, name the animals, tend the garden. And who would sum up the praises of the world, the praises of the trees and the seas and the animals and so on, and present them in articulate speech before God. This is the vocation of being human. And that vocation remains. Come back to that in a moment. But when humans mess up and say, no, we don't want to do that. We've got our own way of doing this. And we're going to manipulate the world in our own way. Thank you very much. And, well, God, if there is a God, you can do your own thing. The result of that is not that you have a big, bad, angry God with a big stick about to beat us over the head, but that the project for the creation as a whole is out of joint. You see that in 100, maybe 1,000 different ways, both in the Bible and, of course, in our world. Now, there are many, many mysteries about this. I'm not saying that human rebellion causes, say, earthquakes. You know, a tectonic plate does what a tectonic plate does, and so on. However, many, many things have gone radically wrong in the world as a result of human brokenness. And the plan, the backstory, is about God dealing with the human brokenness in order to put the world right. In other words, God the Creator, promises and intends to put the world right, and so he puts us right in the present in order that we can be part of his putting right project for the world. That's how the story works. And within that you get, if you're a traditional Christian with theories of atonement, incarnation, resurrection, etc., you get all of that. In fact, you get it enhanced. It makes more sense of your traditional frameworks and texts, not less. But what this leaves us with is a vision of a world with the Creator putting it right, doing so through Jesus, and then promising that what he did through Jesus uniquely one-off, that's the news about the event that actually happened. What he did with Jesus, he will do in the future for the whole creation. Hence, the death and resurrection of Jesus point forward to the ultimate event, which is God putting the whole world right, and we are held in between the one event and the other. This is where the rugby story doesn't work quite so well. Another story which I use in the book and which I develop is the ancient historical story of what happened after Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BC. His heir and successor, putative successor, Octavian, ended up in a civil war against Antony, who'd been one of Caesar's best friends, because they could tell the big prize was out there. Only one of them would be the big dog in this great superpower that was the early Roman Empire. And finally, and all the Roman world was on tiptoe waiting to see what would happen, because half of them were with one and half of them were with the other, and half of them hated them both, and it was all very confusing. Finally, Octavian defeated Antony at the Battle of Actium, and Antony and Cleopatra went back to Egypt, where they died not long afterwards. And then Octavian had to go around all the bits that needed mopping up and sorting out before coming back to Rome. But the word would get back to Rome, and this is the point of my telling the story. Something has happened as a result of which the world is a different place. Octavian has won. He's now going to be in charge. You better get your head around that one and your allegiance sorted out. Something will happen. He's coming back to Rome when he's sorted out all the other stuff. And anyone living in Rome between the victory at Actium in 31 and Octavian's return 3 years later would know that they had to order their lives in accordance with the fact that now there was a different system obtaining. Something has happened as a result of which the world is a different place. Something will happen which will complete that, and we live in between the two. So when, as a Christian, I say, well, something has happened, this is the death and resurrection of Jesus, and the gift of this strange, mysterious, sometimes intimate, sometimes frightening force that we call the Holy Spirit, the interval between those gifts and the final putting right of all things is where we live. And that's where the human vocation gets restored. And the human vocation in the New Testament will be, again, to be image bearers. The image, by the way, many of you may have heard this language about being in the image of God, and there are all sorts of theories about what that means. Biblical scholars now are increasingly convinced that what it means is that humans are designed to be a kind of angled mirror, so that you reflect God out into the world. Think of the angled mirror, and you reflect the world back to God. And when humans go wrong, it's when they turn the mirror so that it reflects the world back to the world. And then you go round in a fairly deadly cycle, because the world does not have life in itself. It's a God-given life. So the human task is to bring God's wisdom and flourishing to the world, to make the God. You know, there's an old joke in my country about a clergyman who's walking down the street and he sees somebody digging the garden, and he says, isn't it wonderful what can happen when providence and the hand of man get together and work on something? And the gardener says, you should have seen this garden when providence had it all to itself. Because of course, you know, what's that about? And actually it's a silly joke, it's a well-known joke, but it's a silly joke, because in a Christian or Jewish doctrine of providence, the way God wanted to work in the world, large scale and small scale, is in so many cases through human beings. Of course, you and I didn't make the sunrise or the moonrise last night or this morning. You and I don't do an awful lot of things which nevertheless happen in the world. But the way God wants this world to flourish is by wise human beings taking responsibility, doing things which will bring that flourishing to the world, which is where you guys come in. Because, of course, the world needs information. Thank you. We get much more of it as a result of what you do, actually much more than we can possibly cope with. It's like drinking from a fire hydrant. And whereas when I was a young scholar, I would trudge off to the library and I would get a heavy, dusty volume out and I would look up something and take half the morning and then go and have a cup of coffee to think about it. I now just go brumph and there it is on the screen. Although, of course, sometimes I get conflicting information, even from you guys. So that's something one has to be careful about. But information, generally, obviously, is a very, very, very good thing. And information, the gathering, collecting and disseminating of information, seems to me always has been actually a vital part of the human task. That's why education is something which the Jewish and Christian traditions have always insisted on as being paramount, not just for the elite, but for everyone within reach. That actually giving people the information about the world, about themselves, about life, is enabling. It's part of human flourishing. And suddenly something's happened in this last generation as a result of everything here and in the surrounding area, as a result of which the world as a whole is far better informed than it's ever been. I suppose the question that I have about that, well, I have many questions about it, one of which is, what changes when instead of walking to the library thinking about something, looking it up, going and having a coffee and thinking about it, and then going back to work, instead of that, it takes me 3 seconds to find it through Google or whatever. Something's changed about the way we do research, and I'm not sure that any of us have really come to terms with that yet. Whether we have the time to reflect that we used to, or whether this just does create more time to reflect, because there's less walking around and sitting drinking coffee, whatever. Well, we still walk around and drink coffee, but in the middle of that, there's a difference, obviously, as you know as well as I do, but I want to draw it out, between information and wisdom. And what we find in the Bible, very interestingly, is this famous character called Solomon, one of the early great kings of Israel. Well, he had problems at a certain point, but basically a really extraordinary human being in the tradition. And Solomon, we are told, collected information like nobody had ever done before. He knew all about the trees and the flowers and the birds and the animals. He knew all about what we would call the encyclopedia of information known to humans, and he'd collected this. He had folk who went out and gathered information, all sorts of stuff he knew, and he could teach it and he could inform people. But interestingly, none of that stuff is in the Bible. I would love to have Solomon's lists of trees and animals. That would be brilliant, but we don't. What we have instead is a book called Proverbs, some of which may go back to Solomon, but it's the Solomonic tradition. And Proverbs has a certain amount of information, but it's actually, how do you steer through this minefield of information? How do you navigate a wise course? How do you know which to choose? When all this information is out there, how do you know what you should do now in this human situation? And of course, if I Google for advice on something, I'm sure there'll be all sorts of websites that'll come up telling me exactly how to do everything from planting a tree to fixing a car to whatever it may be I want to do. Cooking a meal, I'm told there are now people whose entire repertoire of cookery is what they find online, recipes and so on. Fortunately, I'm not a cook. I say fortunately for the sake of my family, so that I don't do that, but I can see how useful that is. But the point is that the book of Proverbs and the whole wisdom tradition which comes through into the New Testament and beyond is not simply about information, it's about wisdom. And at the heart of it is that rather strange old line which says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I need to say quickly in brackets that the word fear doesn't mean a kind of a panicky, cringing fear. It means reverence. It means recognizing that God is God and that I'm not God. And it seems to be the danger with so many aspects of our culture, and this isn't a cheap shot at you and what you do, because actually it affects all of us in one sort or another, is that we think by gathering information we're in charge, we are controlling this. The equivalent I see in my culture, interestingly, over the 1990s and then on into the early years of the present century, is that whenever there was a problem in my society at least, and I think this happened in America too, somebody in government and in the civil service thought it was a good idea to get us to fill in forms, often in triplicate, and to sign off on them, so that everything you did had a paper trail which ended up in somebody's office files somewhere, and we all used to grumble and say, are we going to be given extra secretaries to do this? And the answer was no, we can't afford that. So everyone's workload just secretly expands into more and more paperwork, as though by the gathering of information, we will make sure that we're all behaving properly and doing things right. And I have to tell you, I don't think our behavior has changed at all. We just have a lot of very bulging filing cabinets, because the collection of information does not necessarily produce wisdom, but the collection of information can give you the illusion that actually you can play God. Now that you've got all this information, you're in charge. And of course, if you've got information, that does give you power, gives you a lot of power over anyone who doesn't have information. But the real secret is, how do you select, arrange the information, and how do you do so wisely? In the New Testament, that whole idea of wisdom, like so many other things in the Old Testament, comes forward and emerges not just as an abstract ideal, but as a person. Because one of the big categories that swirls around in the New Testament is the idea that Jesus himself is the embodiment of wisdom. St. Paul says, in him are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, which is like, how does that work? How does that cash out? Well, it doesn't mean that if you know Jesus, that if you're a Christian, you will suddenly become a walking encyclopedia. It does mean, however, that if you get to know Jesus and let him reshape your life, then there is at least a chance that in some ways, at least to begin with, and hopefully more as you go on, you will be making wise choices about what from that world of information to harvest, to deploy, to do things with, and in particular, how to use the information wisely for the benefit of the whole world. Because that's the other thing. If you're just gathering information, it can be so that you can simply do whatever you want to do and let the rest of the world be as ill-informed as it wants. But the whole point of wisdom in the biblical tradition is about new creation, that through wisdom, God wants to work through wise human beings in every walk of life in order to bring about healing, repair, flourishing, wise human societies, wise ecologies, wise ways of being in the creation. So the vision of good news of what happened in Jesus and what will happen at the end catches us in between it. When Jesus came out of the tomb on Easter morning, that was the beginning of new creation. So many Christians think, well, he rose again 3 days later, that's fine, so there is a life after death, so we're going to heaven. That's not the point. The point is that when Jesus rose on the third day, this was the launch of the new creation, with Jesus himself as its first example and as its active agent. And God will do finally for the whole creation what happened then at Easter with Jesus' resurrection. That's the Christian good news. And I've suggested that as we think about what it means to be genuinely human within that vision, what we find is a vision of Jesus himself as the embodiment of wisdom, giving us the human vocation, the Solomonic vocation, if you like. Yes, to have as much information as we can, that's wonderful, but then also to know how to use, deploy, navigate it wisely for the benefit not just of ourselves, but of God's whole creation, of his whole world. Now, I've probably said enough to start a few hairs running. My watch says it's nearly 1:30, so we've got about half an hour before I think some of you have to disperse. So what I normally do at this point, which might be a good idea, is just to take a minute and everyone turn to their neighbour and buzz and say what you found puzzling or exciting or dangerous or heretical or whatever it may be. Before I do that, one other thing, because if I didn't say this, I have a colleague who would be cross with me for not saying it. I am working in partnership with the Wisconsin Center for Christian Studies, and they have set up some mass online courses with me as the speaker, though they're doing all the actual work, preparing the course materials and all of that. And if you're interested in following this up, the first one is now out on the letter to the Galatians, and then there are a couple of others coming, one of which is based on simply good news, and then, God willing, there will be more in the months that follow. And the key for this is ntwrightonline.org, www.ntwrightonline.org. So you all know about mass online courses and how all that works. I don't actually know anything about how it works. All I do is sit in my room at home and talk to a camera, and then somebody else does the work. But I told him that I would tell you, so I've now done it. There it is. So now turn to your neighbor and buzz about what you just heard, and then we'll take some questions in just 1 minute.